Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Fateh. Welcome to another edition of Canada Talks. I'm your host, Bhagwant Singh, and I'm joined in the studio by my friend, colleague, and resident expert, Martin Singh.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Paji, it's a pleasure to be back again.
Paji, international politics.
Sure.
Right, this is one of your areas that pick your brain. I mean, for those viewers, I have said it a number of times, but I will reiterate again, Paji's expertise. He did run for one of the third party election, the party that's third in the House of Commons.
Yes.
Right, in Canada, which is the New Democratic Party, ran for the leadership of that election. So he has good, deep understanding of how politics works and how international relations works.
Just so everybody knows, that was like over a decade ago now.
That was over a decade ago. But we're so lucky to have you on our show.
Right? Yeah, and if they look up photos from that, I'm a bit older, it was more black rather than a gray or white beard at that time.
That is for sure.
Yeah.
That is for sure. But you know what? You age, you get wiser. So
hopefully.
and you're sharing that wisdom with us, which is wonderful, right? And so let's, in terms of international relations, right, and a deep dive into Russia. Russia today, obviously, has got his paws into Ukraine. But what is Russia today? Is it getting stronger? I mean, there doesn't seem to be a credible threat to Vladimir Putin.
Well, what it is that there are all kinds of things going on there. So when we talk about, the most obvious one that we would talk about is the war. So the war is not going well for Russia. Now, that being said, it's really hard to measure what is going on there. So, for example, there's been all kinds of resources plugged into the battle, and I'm probably going to pronounce his name wrong, Bakhmut, I think it is the name of the city. So pre-war, I think it had a pre-war population of about 70,000. It's now down between 1,000 and 5,000. It's been the longest battle of the war. The Ukrainians still claim to hold it, and it's the main area where the Wagner private army group that's aligned with one of Vladimir Putin's allies, where they are working. So that Wagner group, if you remember back, Baji, they're the group that went out and recruited all kinds of people from prisons and that type of thing, and they're just throwing waves and waves and waves of people at the front line. But the challenge that's happening there also is that the Wagner leader, whose name escapes me at the moment, and even if it didn't, I wouldn't be able to pronounce it properly. He's been complaining that the Russian leadership, not Putin, but others, have been not supplying him with sufficient ammunition and other equipment needed to take the place. And maybe it's because they don't have it, or maybe that's because they're trying to cut his legs, because he's been critical of the the management of the war in general, and so maybe the generals in charge of the armed forces are trying to teach him a lesson, indirectly on the battlefield. But it's an important piece, because you basically have the Russians not making any progress anywhere. Now, in fairness, we don't expect anyone to make too much progress in a winter fight. In that part of the world. But the Russians did start the war, late February last year, and we're now into April, and there's not much going for them, whereas on the other side, the Ukrainians have now picked up, I think it's 100 Leopard tanks.
From who?
All kinds of folks, including a few from Canada as well. And what's interesting also is that they've picked up some from places like Poland, which is of course a former Soviet satellite with the Soviet Union, which is now part of NATO, and we can discuss that because there were some important events with NATO that relate to Russia, in the past week or so as well. But yeah, so and on top of that, they have the teams for running these Leopard tanks, among others, that are being trained in the use of combined arms, are all being trained up in Germany currently, and their training is near done. There's literally thousands of Ukrainians being trained there, and so they're getting ready to shift back to Ukraine for what they see is a mid or late spring offensive against the Russians once they get all this put into place. And so it has the potential to pose significant difficulties for the Russians. And when they lose, the pressure gets ratcheted up on Russia.
What does it mean for Putin himself?
So there's a bunch of things, like you can never know exactly what's going on there necessarily, but when you look at some of the moves that are being made, so there was the stationing of tactical nuclear missiles or nuclear weapons in Belarus. Belarus, of course, Russia's main ally. They're basically attached at the hip because Russia saved the dictator of Belarus's political career and maybe his life even when the population revolted maybe about 2 years ago now. But there are other cracks starting to form, and so recently there was a defection from the inner circle, not the political inner circle, but you would call the security support staff inner circle. So the person who defected with his family, it was his wife and daughter, if I remember correctly. They managed to catch a flight to Turkey from Russia. He was the main person in charge of securing Vladimir Putin's communications wherever he went. So Vladimir Putin doesn't, according to this person, doesn't fly anywhere anymore because planes can be tracked. Also, too, what it is that travels typically in an armored train, doesn't use a cell phone, and as a result of that, really only has communication with like a small number of trusted advisors. And so he says that he's extremely isolated and paranoid. But what he also goes on to say is that for a 70-year-old man, Vladimir Putin is in exceptionally good health. So if anybody is kind of hoping that he just kind of drops off the picture, not happening.
No, he's exceptionally healthy.
Yeah, and also too that like he's, I guess with the obvious exception of the defector, he's in generally full control of the people who he needs to be in control of around him in order to make things work.
You mentioned about NATO and changes there that are happening via Russia.
Yeah.
What are those changes? What's happening?
So if we were to go back to last year, or even maybe just prior to last year, two countries that had participated in the past with NATO, but never been members of NATO because they always declared their neutrality, were Sweden and Finland. And they did it with the opinion of trying to keep Russia happy. Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine, and Finland and Sweden realize that there's nothing really that can stop a madman, so our efforts are going to waste. And so both of those countries, basically on the spot, made the application to join NATO, which is really the exact opposite of what Putin's intent was at the time. And so they both made their applications. There were some challenges for both, and there continue to be challenges for Sweden. Specifically, Hungary and Turkey were holding out because any country can make an application to join NATO, but in order to formally join, every single nation must agree. So if any single nation chooses to vote against, it's effectively a veto. And so the leadership of the Prime Minister of Turkey was holding out for some time. And like we don't really think about Turkey as a huge player necessarily. They are in NATO. They are massive. They are the second largest military in NATO. And others don't even come close. So yeah, except for of course the United States, which is much larger. So what it is that Finland formally was accepted into NATO this past week. There's still some issues with Sweden that need to get sorted. So Finland became the 31st nation to join NATO. Their flag was raised at NATO headquarters, which I think is in Brussels. All of the foreign ministers, including Canada's foreign minister, were present for this ceremony. And it was seen as significant because they were neutral since NATO's creation back in 1950. But also it's significant because NATO's border with Russia effectively doubles with that addition. So Finland shares a 1,340 kilometer border with Russia. In addition to that, Finland's not a super huge country. They possess significant military firepower, particularly in the area of artillery. I think their artillery arsenals like larger than Poland, Germany, and some other bunch of European countries combined.
Right.
Yeah, and so
why is that?
I have no idea what the tactical reasoning is behind that. And to be frank, even though I'm a military guy, I only came to learn of it recently, so I can't claim any great insight on that whatsoever. But it's not a small thing. Like them coming to the table is not purely symbolic, I guess is where I'm going with that. Like there is a significant strategic military advantage with regards to kit and personnel that they're able to bring to the table.
Baji, why is what's the block on Sweden? Who's blocking Sweden? So Turkey and Hungary, but why?
Yeah, well, it's primarily Turkey, and Hungary's just trying to be belligerent, I think, because they are a bit pro-Russia, or at least their current leader is. So inside of Turkey, there's been a long-standing battle with what they call the KKK. Now, the KKK is not the KKK Ku Klux Klan that we think about here in North America. It's the Kurds. Yes, exactly. And so what it is that Turkey, accuses Sweden of harboring Kurdish terrorists and allowing them to do protests, inside the country, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I mean, it's much like in Canada. The Kurds, however many live here, and I don't know how many do, but I imagine we have some, wanted to do a protest in Canada. No one's stopping them, same with Sweden. And so, the Turkish Prime Minister takes exception to this, and so there's more work to be done there. That being said, though, like whether or not they're covered by NATO or not, I think that the Swedes could count on folks coming to their aid if the Russians ever went after them. Because the thing is this with NATO, it's Article 5. Are you familiar with Article 5 or no? Okay.
And I'm sure some of our viewers.
Yeah, so Article 5 of the NATO treaty is the one that people talk about the most. And that article states an attack on one is an attack on all. Right? And so you're really, inviting fire and brimstone should you go after anyone. And this is a significant piece because there are a number of former Soviet countries. We mentioned earlier Poland, but I think like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, if I remember correctly, like there's a bunch of those former Eastern Bloc countries that later went on to join NATO. And this is, causing Russia some difficulty. But I share with you, it is my full expectation that once this war ends, because I wouldn't bring them in during the war, but once this war ends, I fully expect Ukraine to be brought into NATO. Like, I would be in shock if it did not happen.
There's one thing you mentioned is the madman Putin.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure how mad he actually is. I mean, not medically speaking, but
sure.
If you're in his shoes, what is he seeing?
Well, that's a difficult thing to measure, Baji. So what it is that, there are a number of people in Russia that lament the fall of the former Soviet Union. And they see various countries as their own, particularly those countries that may have large ethnic Russian populations like Ukraine has. Now, I'm not so sure how enthusiastic those ethnic Russians would be now to go back to Mother Russia, given that, a lot of those lands are literally in the battlefield area getting blown to pieces because they're in eastern Ukraine. And what it is that like the area, I think it's in the southern, it might be even in the Crimea, that is the area historically, if I remember correctly, that's seen as kind of like the birthplace of the Russian Orthodox Church, meaning that there was a conversion that was done there years and years ago from one of the old pagan faiths to Orthodoxy. And the head of the Russian Orthodox Church is a supporter of the invasion of Ukraine. And you can see fallout from this still. So what it is that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which previously was under the Russian Orthodox Church, has completely broken off and gotten recognition, I don't think from all of the other Orthodox heads, and I don't know how many there are. You'd have to forgive me. I think there might be like 11 or 13. Like your Coptics are in there from Egypt and the Greek Orthodox, among others. But they have broken off, and in addition to that, there is, and it makes the news relatively frequently, there is huge tension between a number of the Orthodox priests that remain inside of Ukraine who are seen as being loyal to Russia rather than Ukraine itself. So there's this, I think it's in Kyiv, in the capital. There's like a hundreds of year old, religious facility, and the government has revoked its lease and asked all the priest members to leave. They're refusing to leave, and there's kind of like a standoff that's existing there. But given that they're people of faith, the Ukrainian government, I guess, has chosen, at least so far, not to send in the troops to get them out. But there are significant challenges there. And so back to your main question, though, like Putin sees Ukraine sees it as part of Russia, and it should be included there. And then from a faith perspective, he's gotten, the approval of the Russian Orthodox Church head of faith to say, yeah, this should belong to part of us as well. And so this is the argument that goes there. Now, there are other pieces that are tied in there. Like they say that they're, denazifying Ukraine and this and that sort of thing. I'm not so sure how true that is,
some of the former Soviet countries do have a big fascist problem,
and Ukraine certainly has part of that. Like there is a small section of their armed forces that is absolutely fascist, and may even be neo-Nazis for that matter, because there was concern some time ago that the Canadian Armed Forces might have been actually involved in training that particular group, and people in Canada were saying it should not be done. That being said, though, to say that that's the Russian reason for invading Ukraine would be an absolute ruse, right? Like it's not at all the case. And so Russia, is now showing itself to be very weak. In fact, like, I mean, if it can't roll over a country right on its border, then they're in trouble.
Yeah, but the country is also propped up by everyone else. I mean, Russia's not really just fighting the Ukraine, though there's Ukrainian soldiers, but like you said, the whole of NATO's behind Ukraine.
Well, I mean, like they're not sending troops in, yeah. Equipment and gold, as it were, right? Is absolutely rolling in there, no doubt. But to be fair, the flip side of that was like, Russia's an enormous country. They claim to have an enormous military. The supply lines are relatively short. They have Belarus on side as well, which is where they did the initial launch of the attack to go after Kyiv, right, the capital of Ukraine. If they're not able to manage that, are they able to manage anything? It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah. So, the internal political situation in Russia, though it is nominally a democracy, just your reaction to that.
Yeah.
It says a lot. Yeah. But how democratic is it? Number one, but number two, what is the opposition like inside Russia itself?
Yeah, there's virtually none. So, like, I mean, people see Navalny as the leader of the opposition. I'm not sure there'd be a whole lot of difference between him and Putin, frankly. If he were to become head of the government, Putin controls all the media, all the state apparatus or apparati are all under his control. I don't think they're like if folks are thinking that something might happen internally, I think that they are grossly overestimating the situation there. Now, are there some people who are willing to act out? There are, and there was good evidence of that this week, not against Putin himself, but there is a very nationalist war blogger who was invited to speak to a nationalist group in St. Petersburg. And St. Petersburg is a bit significant symbolically because it's Putin's home city. And he got himself blown to pieces and was killed, right on video, actually, when he was getting ready to talk to the folks. The Russians believe that they have arrested the activist responsible because there was an anti-war activist there in the crowd, and they think that she was the one that actually planted the bomb, and there was a confession on television, of course, and everything else, but you don't know if the confession's been coerced or whatever the situation is, but yeah, so like, I mean, there may be, small isolated individual acts of rebellion and that sort of thing, but they're not touching Vladimir Putin.
So Russia, obviously, this foreign policy is not just with the United States, I mean, or with NATO or the war. It also maintains relationships and a huge border with China.
Yeah.
Right, and obviously the BRIC countries. People talk about the BRIC: Brazil, Russia, India, China.
Yeah.
And I did come across a piece about currency, but I don't recall what it was. So maybe unless you know. But Russia and China.
Yeah.
What is their relationship like, and does it pose a counter to the U.S.?
So I would say prior to the war, they probably saw each one as equals. China no longer sees Russia as an equal. They see them very much as a much smaller younger brother, as it were. They, show warm feelings to each other. President Xi Jinping went there for a visit recently. But the Chinese are trying to present themselves as a group that can negotiate agreements. Most recently, they were actually able to bring, a bit of a détente between the government of Iran and Saudi Arabia, who, if you're not aware, tend to not be friendly with each other in that area of the world. So that's what's going on there. But like China is very much the bigger brother in that relationship. If we move on to the other BRIC countries, India has been buying huge amounts of Russian oil, which, of course, generates dollars for the government to, directly use to fight in Ukraine. But I don't think that the Indian government cares a whole lot about what happens to the people in Ukraine. So they're just taking an opportunity to take advantage of the pricing that they have currently in place. On the currency piece, I don't know all the details on that, but what they are trying to do, and I don't know how involved Brazil is on that, but certainly Russia, China, and perhaps India, maybe a few others, are trying to develop a global currency to combat the strength of the US dollar. And part of this is to just have control of their own finances, but also they want to be able to be independent of the financial system leverage that the United States has in putting sanctions on countries, like they have done with the Russians. So for example, if China wanted to invade Taiwan, they wouldn't want to have, large parts of their financial system shut down by the Americans. And so this is the motivation for the currency piece as it's currently being put together.
And we've got about 3-4 minutes left. Do you know how the currency works? Because I don't really understand how the currency piece would work, or is it something?
So the thing is this. I think that we would it would be heavy speculation on our part to predict what Putin and the Chinese government and the others are trying to put together. I think that the design is desired to be such that it can be, manipulated or influenced by the United States, right, and their allies, as it were. But ultimately, I think that they wanted to be able to function in much the same way that the US dollar functions, meaning that when you buy oil and that sort of thing in most places in the world, except for Russia currently, because they want you to buy it in rubles so that it supports their currency, it's generally bought and sold in US dollars. And I say that for oil. There's a bunch of other commodities that function in that way as well. So the US dollar functions as the global base currency, which provides its strength in addition to all the other power that comes to it through the U.S. government. It's my understanding that they're looking to try to develop some similar type of currency that would have that type of strength that they would be able to use, on commodity markets and have it be, generally recognized.
Right. Just the last couple of minutes, last 2-3 minutes. Where's the future of Russia going now?
So what it is, you might recall that we talked about at the beginning of the show that, the Leopard tanks are coming online, troops are being brought back in that have been trained in Germany and that sort of thing. There is expectation of an offensive to come in Ukraine. Whether it happens in the south closer to Crimea or whether it happens more in the east in the Donbass region or other places, we don't really know yet. But the Ukrainians are going to want to try to catch the Russians on the back foot. And I think it would be optimistic to say that they would push them out of all of Ukraine this year, but certainly to drive them out of another significant part of the country that they had previously held. And on top of that, if they're able to collect back parts of eastern Ukraine that had been effectively held under Russian rebel control since 2014, that would be a significant piece. Like, that would be a significant victory for the Ukrainians. And they could go back to the Americans and their European allies to say, hey, we're doing good work with what you're giving us. Keep giving it to us. And so that's my expectation. So there's a lot at stake for the Ukrainians as well, because if they have the kit and they're not able to make progress, then folks may be less inclined to continue support. But from what we've seen so far from the Ukrainians, they've been significantly and well motivated. I mean, it is, of course, the future of their country and people and language at stake. So they want to make it work.
On that note, we have to leave it here until next time. Till next week, ask Sangat to stay safe and secure and in Chardhi Kala. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.